brief time and introduce here Dr. John Kirkegaard. So John, he is a Chief Research Scientist with CSIRO in Australia. He's a farming systems agronomist doing a lot of his research on water use efficiency and how to increment productivity. John is spending here a few months with us, 6 months to be more precise, from April through the end of September. And during his time here, we discussed with the AGSA, and together between the Department of Agronomy and the AGSA, we're doing this seminar series where John will kind of take us through a lot of the research that he has done over the years and in terms of improving cropping systems productivity and resiliency. So today is his first seminar, Farming the Driest Continent on Earth, Transforming Productivity Through Farming Systems Synergy. The remaining seminars, as he will talk to you a little bit later, are going to be more focused in different disciplines, right? And the dates are still a little bit to be determined, although we do have some tentative dates here to get John going. So thanks for the AGSA for helping coordinate this. Thank you for being here today. And please help me welcome John to the stage.
Thanks, Romulo, and thanks, everybody. Thanks for the very warm welcome here to Kansas State University. And as Romulo said, today is the first of what I hope to be a series of seminars. Because it's the first one, I'm trying to just cover a lot of ground, not too much detail about anything, but give you a bit of a feel for what I do and what I've done. There is some structure to it around this idea of synergies. So hopefully you'll get that message. I should first of all say I'm here as a distinguished fellow with the Fulbright, as a Fulbright scholarship, and I came very late to the Fulbright party, as it were. I wished I'd have known about this this program a lot earlier, and I recommend to anybody at any stage of their career to have a look at the Fulbright opportunities. There's lots of great opportunities for scholarships, for travel at any stage of your career, and essentially it's a cultural exchange program between the US and many other countries. It's 80 years old this year. 400,000 people have had scholarships, so quite an amazing program. As Romulo said, I'm here sort of embedded in the agronomy department, mostly with Romulo's team, but I'm here for 6 months. Since Fulbright is a cultural exchange, I want to just explain the biscuits at the back of the room. Those are Anzac biscuits. Anzac stands for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Our Anzac Day, which is the 25th of April, which was sort of yesterday in Australia and today here, I think, but the 25th of April anyway. I'd be on a day off if I was in Australia, because that's kind of our Memorial Day. And the Anzac biscuits are a recipe that was made by people during World War I to send to soldiers in the trenches, because all of the ingredients would travel by sea without spoiling. So Julianne, my wife, made those. So please, if you haven't got one already, grab one before you leave. There's a bit of cultural exchange. So my talk today, this is an outline of some of the topics I want to cover. As I said, I want to dip in and out on a few different topics. Hopefully you'll see how they mesh together throughout the talk. As Romulo said, I'm a farming systems agronomist, so basically all of my career I've mostly been working in the field with growers, looking at ways predominantly to use water more efficiently, water being the main limiting factor in Australian farming systems. I've probably looked more at things that are going on in the soil than I have things in the atmosphere, although you need to understand both. And I spend a lot of time in the field talking directly with growers and advisors. So that's a little bit about kind of my background. A little bit of geography. Hands up, who's been to Australia? Okay, so we've got a few people. Well, it's not a competition. A kangaroo would never beat a bison anyway, but we're both big countries. We both understand that sort of that tyranny of distance. But you can see there from a latitude point of view, most of Australia is sort of closer to the equator than a lot of the US. So our winters are nowhere near as harsh. We can have animals in the field all year round. but it is quite dry. We in the southern part of Australia, we can only really grow one crop per year. We sow in the autumn and harvest in the early summer and grow those crops through the winter. We're both very, very large wheat producing countries, and of course Kansas is a major wheat producing state. As I said, it's not a competition, but let's make it a competition. Look, we both produce a lot of wheat. You guys tip us for area and yield, and therefore tonnage, but we export a greater proportion of what we grow. We export about 80% of what we grow. So I guess both countries are important in terms of global trade, and what happens in both countries is important to the international price of wheat. Again, a little bit more detail. You can see that we mostly grow crops in that what we call the wheat belt in Australia. So it sits between about 600 millimetres and 300 millimetre rainfall isohyets. It sort of curves right around the southern and western part of the country. But it's dry and variable by international standards. We share that with Kansas, but I think you guys have a lot better soils in general than we do. We have a lot of old weathered soils with a lot of issues, whether it's acidity or shallow, infertile, compacted, salty. We have a lot of issues with soils. Our agriculture is less subsidised, and so that makes it quite risky for growers, and we always have to keep in mind then when we're recommending new management strategies about that risk element. So essentially, as I said, we grow one crop per year. Forget about the months there, they won't make any sense to you, but look at the seasons. So we have a summer fallow, we're sowing in autumn and flowering in the spring and maturing in summer. And I guess the climatic risks we share, we have no idea when the breaking rains following the summer will happen. So we might be sowing in April, we might be sowing in June or July. We can get frosts at flowering time, and obviously heat and drought comes in late. So these are the risks, I guess, that sort of has that we have to negotiate when we're setting up our farming system and our cropping systems. And I think, like parts of the US, climate change is biting in Australia as well. If you look at the trend, it's drying and warming, particularly in that southern part of Australia that I just showed you, where we grow most of the crops. So, the last 20, 25 years has been, in some areas, some of the driest on record. Now, this word synergies, let me just talk a little bit about that. So I guess if you think about the first agricultural revolution, okay, it wasn't a single innovation. It was several innovations. Many of them have been around, some for centuries, okay, but it was the way those innovations were brought together in a system that really drove a huge improvement in productivity. And Lloyd Evans in his book sort of makes that point. So that's an example, I think, probably one of the first of a really significant synergy in agricultural production. None of those things alone would have taken us where all of them together took us, and often it's synergistic. It's more than the sum of the parts. You could say the US maize revolution is a similar example, and Duvik explained this quite nicely. The breeders and the agronomists like to argue over who's contributing more, but almost all studies indicate both contribute, and where they synergize, I think that's where we can sort of look for larger step changes in productivity. And in Australia, if you go back to when we first started growing wheat and you look at that history right through to sort of recent years, you can see it features periods, aside from the original sort of mining phase before we had superphosphate as a fertilizer, where we were just mining fertility essentially. After that, things came together, like the new wheat varieties that Farah bred, combined with that superphosphate and fallowing. You can see we had these step changes, but then periods of sort of plateauing and stagnation until a combination of technologies came together again. In the 40s and 50s, it was the lay pasture system based on clover pastures, improving fertility. And you can see one there starting in the 80s and through the 90s, a really big boost in productivity with the adoption of conservation agriculture and a range of other other things. Looking back on that, I see that was another synergy of several factors. In the area where I was operating in southern New South Wales, essentially canola came in as a break crop in the wheat system. Until then, we pretty much grew wheat and barley, and we had grassy pastures. So the whole system was riddled with wheat root diseases. Wheat yielded 1 to 2 tonnes per hectare. That was profitable. We didn't probably realise at the time what was possible until we started growing canola. And you can see that picture in the centre there, wheat after wheat and wheat after canola, the difference farmers saw once they got that rotation into the system. But we needed lime to grow canola. It was acid sensitive. So the lime, the canola, suddenly wheat's yielding much more and actually responding to nitrogen fertiliser and needing nitrogen fertiliser, because now we're growing 4 tonnes and not 2 tonnes. All of this was facilitated by the adoption of no-till. And you can see how the lime, the canola area and the use of nitrogen fertiliser all took off in the 90s as this sort of new production system, and the wheat yield pretty much followed that up. So I guess that's what I mean when I talk about synergies, that none of these alone really would have taken us where we gotten us to the yield levels we achieved. So, and by the end of that period, we had pretty well adopted no-till farming. It was almost sort of saturated in different areas across the country, and we were adopting these sorts of modern no-till farming systems around soil protection, water conservation, but also labour, machinery, time. All of these logistical benefits were what farmers were really seeing as well. But at the end of that period, you can see in sort of from 2002 onwards, we entered a period that we now call the Millennium Drought. It was a full decade of well below average rainfall, very late rains. And you can see for the first time, our productivity nationally just turned around. And around about 2010, we were really starting to wonder, like, have we hit the ceiling? Where can we go? We didn't think we were at potential yields nationally. But I want to talk about a project that commenced around that period. It was called the National Water Use Efficiency Project. And I want to just briefly talk a bit about that project and some of the innovations that flowed from it. So I think one of the real, we have an organisation called the GRDC, the Grains Research and Development Corporation. So that's a body that takes $1 for every tonne of wheat that's sold, puts it into a research fund. The government adds $1, and that money is used for research. It's about $250 million a year now in Australia, and the committees that decide what research is going to be funded involve farmers and industry people and scientists. So everybody in the industry is pretty much involved in making those decisions. They challenged growers with this project. So this money, $17.5 million over 5 years, was targeted to growers and grower groups. And they were asked to tell the GRDC how they thought they were going to improve water use efficiency by 10% over the next 5 years. So CSIRO and other organisations were involved in the projects, more to coordinate, to provide some farming system science and some modelling into the project. But the ideas were fed up through the grower groups, and all sorts of ideas came up. Some people wanted to focus in crop. They wanted to look at new varieties and nitrogen management and sowing dates and things like that, all sorts of things that happen in the crop. But lots of the growers sort of were thinking before the crop. They were thinking the way we manage the fallow could improve, management of weeds and stubble, improved rotation, so even going back the year prior. And some thought that the long-term management of the soil could be improved, and that was really where improvements could be made. If you think about water use efficiency, at the bottom of that picture, you can see all of those different factors. Any one of them could influence how efficiently a crop uses water ultimately. And so this project ran for 5 years. Different grower groups focused on different parts of this sort of diagram, but we came together annually. They all saw what each other was doing, and so they could discuss, you know, what else was happening, whether they were onto a good thing or others were making more progress. And that interaction was really, really beneficial. I'm just going to cut a long story short, there's a couple of papers there from the early part of that project and then towards the end of it. But essentially, we started with a system where, we were growing continuous cereals. We were letting sheep graze the weeds in the summer, thinking that green pick is good for them, clean up a bit of the residue. Any residue that was left, we tended to burn, maybe do a cultivation if need be, sowing in May with a normal kind of spring variety. And we did some pre-experimental modelling of this system, and the average yield was 1.6 tonnes with that system. If we just changed one thing at a time, for example, if all we did was move to a better rotation with canola, but we didn't change anything else about that system, we could see an improvement in average predicted yield. Likewise, if we control summer weeds with herbicides and kept the sheep off, we could see quite a big improvement because the weeds were stealing water and nitrogen from that crop. If we moved to no-till, but we didn't change anything else, likewise an improvement. Sowing earlier, again, some improvement. And at that time, we were experimenting with some wheat varieties that we could sow earlier, which I'll talk about in a minute, which had a longer coleoptile and a better phenology for early sowing. What we found was if we put all of that together in a system, we could take the predicted yield was 4.5 tonnes per hectare, from 1.6 to 4.5 when you put all those together. And in fact, to cut a long story short, within the 5 years that program was running, we had farmers who were achieving, getting up towards that sort of yields that they had never, believed were possible. So combinations of simulation, experiments. The adoption was very fast because the ideas were from the farmers. We were testing their ideas. So those that worked, those that they could see would work, and the fact they were all working together and seeing how the system worked meant that it was adopted quite quickly. The other thing we realised is that whilst all of those yield improvements are essentially at a paddock or a field level, if you're sowing, if you've got a 5,000 hectare farm, you might be sowing over 20 days. If you can start earlier, then all of your fields move earlier. So all of them get a knock-on benefit from the fact you can actually start your sowing program earlier. And that's quite a multiplier on a large farm in Australia. And this paper, again, a combination of actual experimental evidence and modelling, demonstrated that if we could get these early sowing systems to work, keep the flowering date where it needed to be for the frost and heat risk, but move systems earlier, then we could get quite a large predicted boost. And then essentially that's what has been happening in Australia. Because farms are getting bigger, because climate change is hitting, people have been moving their sowing programs earlier. And I mentioned the long coleoptile wheats, just let me explain this. So when we developed the semi-dwarf wheats, which were shorter, that was a massive improvement in yield potential. But unfortunately, it also shortened up other cells in the plant, including the coleoptile. So you can't sow these varieties very deep because the coleoptiles are quite short because of the RHT1 and RHT2 semi-dwarfing genes. So Greg Rubetsky, who is a geneticist in our team, he searched for, and others were searching for, alternative dwarfing genes that keep the crop short but don't shorten organs like the coleoptile. And he found some sources of genes. He got them into adapted wheat. And you can see in that picture there that if the moisture, at the end of summer is down sort of 10 or 15 centimetres and out of reach of a semi-dwarf with short coleoptile, you can still sow into that moisture and establish your crop using stored summer moisture rather than waiting for the autumn break. Because remember, the autumn break's just starting to become less and less reliable and less total. So we could utilise these varieties to sow early when moisture was at depth. And again, a nice paper predicting, as the early sowing paper showed, that this is a way to facilitate that and to get significant improvements in yield. Of course, putting a seed down at 10 centimetres or below, you can't just do that and not change anything else. Getting back to the idea of synergies, we needed to think about, and there is a current program just wrapping up on all of the interactions that you need to think about when you put a seed down that deep. First of all, you need a machine that can do that. We used to put the fertiliser deep and the seed shallow. Now we're putting the seed deep. So can we put the fertiliser shallow, or what do we need to do with the fertiliser? There's herbicide interactions, there's some soil-borne diseases where the inoculum's mostly in the surface. We're seeing some big benefits with rhizoctonia control and other diseases. So there's a whole lot of G by E by M interactions that need to be sorted out to get this system to work well. And I sort of call what Greg is doing breeding for system resilience rather than breeding for crop resistance. So Romulo mentioned this in his talk last week, but other examples of this sort of thinking is, we know we're going to get frosted even though we do our best to avoid it. And if we do, can we make the wheat more profitable by having a really high hay quality wheat with no awns and a high quality hay so that we've still got a profitable product. Likewise, if you don't have moisture at depth and the rain doesn't come till July, can we get a wheat that can mature in 100 days? Greg's been doing recurrent selection for extremely vigorous, fast maturing wheats. He selected for the width of the second leaf, and he's now got wheat that's as vigorous as barley. And so this is another project where we're trying to find traits in wheat that don't necessarily mean you can resist climate change, but you can still make money when climate change happens. Now, all of that stuff I just talked about was focused on wheat, but canola is now a very important crop in Australia, and canola's even going to benefit even more from a lot of this thinking because canola is even more susceptible to heat and to drought. It's an extremely profitable crop if you can get a good yield and a good oil. So we've been doing quite a lot of work, similar work in canola, and we had a project from 2014 to 19 called the Optimised Canola Profitability Project. I mean, we went through a lot of the same thinking. What's the optimal flowering period for canola, and can we develop earlier sowing systems for canola to hit that optimum flowering period and increase our yield potential? First thing we needed to know was when is the critical period? When is canola's yield affected most by any kind of stress? This hadn't been done for canola. It's been done for many, many other crops, but we found that it was in this period around 300-degree days after the start of flowering. Once we knew that, we could think about, and this was work done by Julianne, what's the optimal flowering period for canola in all these places around Australia where we grow canola. The optimum flowering period is defined as the time when the combined risk of drought, heat and frost is at its minimum, the combined risk. Okay, you can't avoid them all the time. And so we used AppSim to predict when we thought that optimum period was. And then we had to do a lot of work to work out what's driving flowering time in canola. We used to think it was day length. Turns out it's all vernalisation. So our spring canola varieties just have a very small amount of vernalisation, or the varieties that do well from earlier sowing do that using vernalisation rather than day length. We can grow winter types which have a bit of both, but we generally grow spring types. And so out of all of this work, this graph I really like because that project finished in 2019, and by then we were able to give people around Australia charts like this for different regions around Australia and for different maturity types of canola. When are the optimal time to be flowering? And this is what they were being advised in 2015. So you can see how much we were able to move the optimum sowing time earlier. And when we did that, this is just an example from a whole range of experiments in 2018 with different mean yield potential. You can see at almost all yield levels, except the really extremely low yield levels, there was a benefit for these earlier sowing systems with hybrid varieties and more robust nitrogen strategies, which was precisely the opposite of what we thought. We thought you want a low vigor canola, keep the nitrogen low, don't sow it too early. We thought they would just grow and run out of water and crash, right? That was the thinking. Everything's going to crash. But what they do is they grow quickly, they cover the ground, they prevent evaporation, they trade water for carbon more efficiently, and they get their roots deeper. And all of that adds up to this higher yield potential. And we've managed to put all that into a set of tips in an extension brochure that was quite popular with growers. So since then, Julianne and her team have done a lot more work to try to bring this information to growers. with phone apps. So this is a sort of a prototype flowering calculator that's on the web, where a grower can either ask which variety should I sow? Like, I live here, it's this day of the year, which variety would you recommend I sow? Or I've got this variety in the shed, when should I sow it? So, and then it will provide that grower with a graph like this. The dark blue line is the optimal flowering period. This is for a 9th of April sowing date for canola. And what it shows there is a whole range. A few varieties are sowing too early, several are flowering too early, several are flowering too late, but there's 2 or 3 varieties there that the grower could select from that would be the right varieties for that sowing date and variety combination. The second thing we've been working on is, if we're going to move canola sowing earlier into hotter, dry conditions, we know that, establishment of canola is a real challenge under those conditions. So what can we do agronomically and genetically to try to improve the success of establishment from early sowing? And so we thought, well, if the long coleoptile works in wheat, how about a long hypocotyl in canola? So canola is a tiny seed. It has a different, its cotyledons have to be pulled above the ground. But we thought potentially there's genetic variation for hypocotyl length. Turns out there was, and it turns out that Australian varieties have very short hypocotyls, which was good for us. What it meant was we could consider utilising some of the material from overseas to try and get some of these genes for longer hypocotyls into Australian varieties. This graph kind of shows that when we look at how they emerge from 5 centimetre depth compared to 2 centimetre depth, that would normally reduce emergence of Australian varieties by about 50%. You can see that those other varieties with longer hypocotyls generally were emerging better from 5 centimetres than the Australian varieties compared to how they were doing with normal sowing depth. And just to show you a picture of that, like here's a picture of the best Australian variety sown at 2 centimetres depth or 5 centimetre depth, and you can see how much it's affected the establishment. If we took the best international variety, just wasn't bothered by going to 5 centimetres at all in terms of establishment. So I'm not a breeder, but Matt Nelson he has a project underway trying to see if they can get some of those genes into the Australian varieties. And again, if we're going to put canola at 5 centimetres or deeper in order to get it up early, there's a whole lot of agronomy and a whole lot of questions then. Is it just the length of the hypocotyl or is it the strength? What happens if you get furrow infill after a storm of rain just after you sowed? Can they still emerge? And what effect does this seed placement have on the temperature and the water content of these soils, particularly sandy soils? So quite a bit of that G by E by M work going on. Okay, so moving on to dual purpose crops. If you're going to sow early and you've got animals in your system, that's a real opportunity to get some grazing value. And so in Australia, we graze both wheat and canola. In our higher rainfall areas, we can tend to get more regular early sowing opportunities, and we can use some winter types, which give us a really long grazing period. We've done a lot of work in all different aspects of this grazing crop scenario. I won't go into all of them, but yeah, our team's sort of worked on all aspects. But one of the things I will sort of talk about is the lock-up time. So aside from early sowing, I think the other key success factor in dual-purpose crops, in our system at least, is the lock-up time, or when you take the animals off. And I think we all know, and it seems to be consistent here in the US, that you want to get the animals off before they start biting reproductive parts, so before elongation happens. But we also have done a lot of work on the effect of residual biomass. So how much biomass are you leaving at the time you take the animals off? And that's because, so we sort of divide this up into, you've got really safe times for grazing early on when the crop's got plenty of time to regrow, when the growing points are low. You've got unsafe time when you know you're going to be biting off heads. But in the middle, there's this sensitive period where the yield that you achieve is going to sensitive to how much biomass you've left, because it's got to grow back to produce yield from a low base. And in our data, we would see this sort of variability in recovery, and I think it was driven by residual biomass. And the way we think about this is that, for example, if you want a 5-ton wheat yield, you're going to need about 9 tons of biomass at anthesis. And if you need 9 tons of biomass at anthesis, and you know what day you're taking the animals off, and you know how much biomass is there, you can calculate whether you're going to hit that or not, just based on the growth rates for your area. So here's an example where there was a 4.4 tonne per hectare yield potential in that particular year, based on how the season unfolded. If that's your yield potential, you can see how the anthesis biomass on the x-axis influenced whether or not we hit that yield potential. Now, there wasn't any point in growing 12 tonnes because the yield potential was only 4.4, so you're only going to get that, right? But if you went below about 8.5 to 9 tonnes, you started to lose yield. And so what that means is the amount of residual biomass you've got to leave as you go later and later with your grazing is going to increase. And therefore, it's a second management lever that growers can have if they're wanting to graze late. For example, if often our farmers are fattening lambs, they're extremely valuable, so they want to keep grazing. But if they're grazing, if the grain price happens to be high, this is a trade-off that they can manage. We've also done a fair bit of work just looking at, again, like the early sowing, there's a huge number of whole farm benefits to having stock on crops in our kind of feed gap, in the feed gap time of our year. These are some of the earliest sown crops on the farm, so you can get them in very early. That has a benefit. You're getting animals off earlier at higher weights. You're giving your pasture a spell, so when the animals come back with lambs or calves, there's a much better pasture wedge of feed. And so the whole farm profit can really be boosted by including some area of dual purpose crops. And again, we've put this together in a information booklet that's available on the web if anybody is interested in that. All right, I've talked a bit about early sowing and grazing, sort of goes hand in hand, and that alone will allow you to get roots deeper, to utilise soil resources more effectively. But we have a lot of soils in Australia that are not deep, that have all sorts of problems, and so I thought I'd talk a little bit about the recent sort of revolution almost in Australia on these soils. Long-term no-till farming on some of these soils has led to a whole basket of different issues, particularly these sandy soils, of which there's a lot in South Australia and Western Australia. So if you practice long-term no-till, you can get water repellents in the surface due to sort of organic matter coating. You get herbicide-resistant weeds, compact acid layers, and you get these. You can see what it does to sort of production in that photo there. Now, there's a simple solution to that, and that's, pull out the moldboard plough and invert all of that. And simultaneously, you can deal with, if you put lime on when you do that, you can pretty much fix up all those problems in one pass. So we call this strategic deep tillage. You can see at the bottom of that photo on your right how much that can improve crop growth and fix up a lot of these issues with one pass. Now, our farmers are all no-till, so this was something that they didn't really want to be doing. But as it turns out, if you can time this well, you may only have to do it once every 10 years. But it's a new innovation that's had a lot of research in recent years. I mean, ripping, pretty much people used to call dragging any piece of steel through the soil ripping, but there's a whole science around it now. There's a whole lot of agricultural engineering with delvers and spaders and inclusion plates and all sorts of things that really help to manipulate the soil in a way that overcomes these constraints and makes it far more economical. My colleague Therese McBeath is doing this, but that's the sort of difference you can just see side by side with these soils with one pass of some of this machinery. Obviously, you've got to avoid the risk, otherwise you can get serious erosion. So when you do it and how you do it is very important. But again, there's now projects underway to work out all of these considerations of how do we get the agronomy right around these new systems to make sure that all of these things can be optimised. And just getting back to the long coleoptiles, if you fluff up a sandy soil with this sort of equipment, one of the difficult things that happens is if you're sowing something like canola, it can just disappear to depths where it won't emerge. So the long coleoptile wheats are really helping on these recently ameliorated soils, and we see yield benefits in these sort of spaded soils far greater than just in normal no-till soil, simply because these long coleoptile varieties are able to handle the fact that they sometimes get pushed a little deeper under those circumstances. And I just to get a feel for the scale and the scope of this and what's going on, you can just read those there. Enormous yield responses lasting up to 8 years. So not surprisingly, a lot of growers are adopting this strategic deep tillage. It's clearly profitable, and it's also improving water use efficiency. Obviously, once you've got the water right, you've got to get the nitrogen right. That's the other big driver of production. In fact, nitrogen is the biggest reason, or inadequate nitrogen is the biggest reason for our yield gap in Australia. It's because our farmers, because of our climate, because of the risk, they are very reluctant to put on more nitrogen than they think they might need, and consequently, we have sort of been running down our fertility. So, inadequate N's the biggest cause of the yield gap, but it's also driving a loss of soil fertility and organic matter. And so I want to show you that increasing nitrogen fertiliser can actually increase our yields, our soil fertility, and reduce greenhouse gas intensity, which is not a common claim in systems where perhaps nitrogen supply where too much nitrogen has been put on. But in our circumstances, it's very different. We're probably underdoing it. And I was, sorry, that's a long-term field experiment that I ran for 30 years, and much of what I'm showing you in this area comes from that trial. The bottom line was that's a no-till farming systems experiment, and even after 20 years of no-till and retaining all that residue that you can see there compared to burning it or cultivating, I wasn't seeing a shift in soil carbon, and that was puzzling. But a PhD student, Clive Kirkegaard, who was in his 60s when he did this PhD, his hypothesis was that we know that stable soil organic matter, the stuff that gives fertility, contains predictable stoichiometric ratios of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur, because it's made up of microbial detritus. And all organisms, you and I and any organism, fundamentally has a stoichiometry which is reasonably stable. So that being the case, every tonne of soil organic matter has to have 85 kilos of N, 25 kilos of P and 12 kilos of S. That's why organic matter provides fertility, right? That's where it comes from. But if you want to build organic matter, you need to put the fertility back. And this is something that perhaps a lot of people overlook. And therefore, Clive hypothesised that the reason I wasn't building any soil carbon was because I was limited by nutrients, not by carbon. And so we did a couple of pretty simple experiments. If you get a soil and you chop up wheat straw, you put it in a bottle and moisten it, and you don't add any nutrients, after 5 weeks, it'll look like the one on the left. If you add nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur at the ratios required by microbes after 5 weeks, it'll look like the one on the right, because the microbes now have what they need to grow, utilise the carbon source and excrete and turn over and create a completely different looking soil. So that was fine in the lab, but we also wanted to try it in the field. So I gave Clive my treatment where I'd been incorporating the residue for sort of 20 years instead of burning it. Still wasn't seeing any increase in soil carbon in those two treatments. And what Clive did was, on one side, he just started adding supplementary nutrients at the time we incorporated the residue. And on the other side, he just incorporated the residue with no nutrients. So same amount of carbon on both sides. The only difference was the nutrients. And after 6 years, we'd lost 3.2 tonnes of carbon where we were just putting the stubble with no nutrients. And we gained 5.5 where we were adding the nutrients. And remember, I was using a rotary hoe to plough this in. So the idea that tillage reduces soil carbon is sort of challenged by this idea. if tillage happens when you have no nutrients available, or you're breaking up a soil with very good structure, then certainly you can lose carbon. In this case, we were using incorporation of stubble and nutrients to build soil carbon. And as it turns out, a lot of people who do greenhouse gas budgets often don't take into account what's going on with the soil carbon. Like they just don't assume that's changing. If I did that on the long-term trial, you can see a whole range of treatments there: burning, no-till or tillage. Clive's treatments are right along there on the other side. You can see where he was both using a rotary hoe and applying more nitrogen, where you might think greenhouse gases would go up. They were actually the lowest greenhouse gas emissions because he was losing far less soil carbon. So just an interesting thing to be aware of when you're trying to build soil fertility. Now, our soils are old, and I'm talking 1 to 2% mostly soil organic carbon levels. Even when they were started to be farmed. So probably different to soils in this part of the world. But okay, so the other way, obviously, to get nitrogen into the system is with legumes. And so we're doing a lot of work in this space at the moment. The problem with legumes, I guess, is that our systems are, as you can see at the bottom, very much dominated by wheat and barley. Canola's come into the picture in recent years, the red colour, but grain legumes, they sort of bump around. We can't seem to get their area up. They're considered risky, price and disease and storage. And so the percentage of legumes in our system, although we'd like it to be higher, generally sits around 5% and drops in a drought when they become even more risky. And I think one of the problems is growers tend to just look at the annual performance of those crops. So they're almost never as profitable in 1 year as a canola crop beside them or a wheat crop beside them. And so they kind of, and that's because a lot of their benefits take time to accrue. So we wanted to look at the value of legumes in the system. Could we make our legumes profitable if you look at them in a system and you look at their impact on the water use efficiency in terms of dollars per hectare per millimetre over a period of time rather than in individual years. So we have a series of experiments. They're in their 9th year this year, 4 sites, and where we've integrated different legumes into the system. We've got different nitrogen levels and also different sowing dates. So this series of experiments kind of pulls together everything that I've been talking to you about, but in the one large systems experimental program. And just to give you an example of some of the results that are coming from this. So we generally have a baseline system which the growers nominated. So that's a canola wheat system sown in early May, and they're generally targeting an average nitrogen level. And from the first 7 years of data, if we compare that system, so that baseline system shown in yellow there, with either a system where we put more canola in with high nitrogen, that's a system that can be really profitable, but you've got to pump a lot of nitrogen in there. Or go to a diverse system where we introduce a legume like faba bean with the canola and pull back on the nitrogen. And just to summarise some of the results in terms of profitability, return on investment and water use efficiency, you can see that the diverse system is essentially ahead of the other systems in all of those parameters. If we look at how much nitrogen is required per year, the efficiency of the nitrogen use and what proportion of gross margin we're spending on nitrogen fertiliser, it's also, the diverse system's also looking good. And on greenhouse gas emissions, because of that lower nitrogen requirement, that's also low. So we're starting to demonstrate to growers that these systems, if you look at them over time, really do perform, in a lot of areas of interest to the farming system. Of course, there are still practical barriers to the adoption of these on farm. So we've set up a new part of this in phase 3, where we have a series of advisor and growers across the area who have split paddocks, and they're looking at integrating a legume on one side and doing their normal system on the other. They all have different interests, and they're all looking for something different out of these more diverse systems. Here's an example of a young farmer and what he was looking for from introducing faba beans to his system. And these are a really good platform, not so much for hard science, but a really good platform for conversations with growers and understanding what are the real barriers to their adopting these systems. Can we work together to sort that out and take the science that's coming out of the small plot work and have it more readily adopted on farm? Okay, coming to the end now. I showed you this graph before and said that we didn't really know where we were heading. In terms of our yield. I'm happy to say that it's continued to move up. The combinations of some of the innovations that I've said have allowed us to continue to improve our yields. In some areas, it's really quite spectacular. In Western Australia, where you can see the rainfall trend in Western Australia has been very much down. That's the blue line there. You can see the millennium drought sort of dragged it down for a while, but it hasn't really recovered. And despite that, our average wheat yields are continuing to go up. And that in recent years has really been driven by this move to earlier sowing systems, now some of these soil amelioration techniques, but a focus on, what is the yield potential? What are the factors that are stopping us from achieving that, and how can we overcome them? And moving us closer and closer to the potential. So the point of all this, I guess, and the message, I suppose, is that as we all work away on some of the new innovations that are coming into agriculture, whether that's digital or robotics, or novel approaches to fertilizers and biological sensors, and all sorts of new non-chemical approaches. As we look at all of those, the lessons from the past are that none of them are going to get you far alone, and you need to be thinking, whichever one you're working on, and we're all working in there somewhere, whichever one you're working on, you have to think about what might you need to put with that to get the best out of it. What interactions might happen in the farming system if I were to be successful with this innovation? What haven't I thought of that I could be putting with this to take it further? And so if you think even of something as simple as being able to singulate wheat, to be able to put a wheat seed precisely in a field where you want it, and to put microdoses of inputs exactly where you want them and where you need them. If we could do that tomorrow, then what kind of wheat plant could we be envisaging that could take advantage of being able to do this sort of stuff? And if you look in the literature, you'll see people fiddling around with all sorts of traits in wheat and attempting to find ways to improve all sorts of different things with the wheat plant. And this is getting more and more possible with gene editing and all sorts of technology. So the question is, how can we foresee where all of these technologies are going, and can we think about combinations of technologies that might synergize in the future? And I guess that's my interest from the lessons of the recent past. And so I'm really interested to be looking at what's coming down the pipeline, and how's it going to fit into the farming system, and how can we take it as far as it can go. So with that, I'll finish up, and I will leave you with a quote from William Farrer, who was the breeder who essentially created the Australian wheat belt by bringing us wheat varieties that were quicker to flour, had disease resistance, and were milling quality. But even he, who is considered a breeder, I think you can see here that he was thinking much more broadly than just the plant. And although he wouldn't have called that G by E by M, I reckon that's what that is. So with that, I'll say thank you. And what I hope to do over my 6 months here is to perhaps have a series of seminars where I go a little bit more deeply into some of those aspects, and to come and talk to you all about what you're doing and learn what's going on in this part of the world. So thank you very much for listening. And I'll take questions if there are any. Stock feed. Yeah, in Australia they're used for stock feed. Yeah. The question was, what are faba beans used for, or faba beans? In Australia they're mostly stock feed, I think, but they produce quite a large biomass, and I think that's part of they're resistant to waterlogging. They produce a large biomass, so they tend to fix a lot of nitrogen and leave a lot of carryover nitrogen. Whereas things like lentils and chickpeas, like they're human food, so they're much more profitable. You make more money per tonne, but you may not leave as much nitrogen in the field because they have such a smaller biomass. But we've had up to 180 kilos more nitrogen in a field after faba beans than after wheat or barley. So they're quite, and that's a big impact on the profit of the following crop if you don't have to put so much nitrogen on, as well as the fact that together with the canola, we call it a double break. Herbicide-resistant grass weeds are our biggest driver at the moment about what we can do. And so quite often we need more than 1 year out of a cereal to get on top of those, and also fusarium, some of the other diseases. So the legume canola double break, as we call it, is becoming one of the tools to help with that. Where people can grow lentils, which is in South Australia, and chickpeas in the north, those are just very profitable crops in their own right, and wheat almost becomes the break crop for the legume there because they're just so profitable. Yeah. In terms of yes, yeah. Look, I think we're seeing warmer spring temperatures, lower and more erratic rainfall, wider frost. Because of the warmer temperatures speeding up crop development, our crops sort of have now a wider frost risk window. So it's ironic that things are getting warmer and frost risk getting worse. That doesn't make sense, but it's all to do with when the crops are maturing. So yeah, I think that's very much part of the slow. The farmers had already started shifting earlier. I think they were already perceiving that issue. Larger farms are driving it as well. In terms of the summer crops, we don't grow so many summer crops in our area, but I think they would also be experiencing just direct heat stress and be dealing with the same sorts of issues. I think the warmer nights too are an issue with some of those crops as well. So it's not just the daytime extreme temperatures, but nighttime temperatures and effects on respiration and other things. But yeah, no doubt we're seeing it. And if you go to grapes, or if you go to some of the horticultural crops, they're just like they're way out of their window, and folks are sort of buying vineyards further south and further south in order to to be able to stay profitable with those. And the heat is one thing. Fires are also more prevalent, and the smoke damage to grapes and the tainting is another issue that's coming up. But yeah, no doubt, I think the farmers are some of the first to sort of be living climate change. And in the West, it's just been quite like a demonstrable step change down in annual rainfall in Western Australia, quite a marked since the 70s. Yeah. Oh, hang on. We'll take one from the. Yeah, so it varies, but depending on the problem. But they're getting as deep as 60 centimetres, but I would say typically 35 to 40 would be the sort of depth that most of the ripping and inclusion and all that sort of thing is going to. On some of the deep sands with the spaders, they're going even deeper. And with the delving, so delving, just so people know, delving is a way of putting these big steel bars down into the soil, and they're designed to just scrape off so underneath the sand is heavy clay. So it's a duplex soil, sand over clay. What they're trying to do is bring some of the clay up to the surface and mix it with the sand. Believe it or not, just very small percentages of clay in the surface can overcome that non-wetting problem. And they can also change the cation exchange capacity and the water holding capacity and a lot of other things. So sometimes they're delving down to sort of 60 centimetres or deeper. But I would say, yeah, 35 to 50 centimetres would be kind of where they're trying to get on top of compact sand layers, which is probably the most common problem. No. So there's no wheat board or anything like that anymore. So yeah, it's kind of controlled by, well, they're basically companies that are like accumulators. So farmers will still deliver to an accumulator who's kind of selling wheat on the world market. Some may line up better markets for feedlots or something themselves, but yeah, I'm trying to remember when that. So the wool went out in the sort of early 90s. The floor price for wool was taken away, and then grains followed maybe a decade or so later when the wheat board and some of those other organisations sort of stopped controlling that. Yeah.
Hi, welcome to Thursday.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. There are only 2 farming systems. Scientists left around the world are still focusing on that area. And first, I would like to acknowledge John Dixon, whom you happen to know. He was the first person to define the farming systems in the 1970s. And they're still using the same farming systems, similar farming systems. Things have changed in the last 50 to 60 years a lot. Do you think it's time to redefine our farming systems? That's number one question. Because we're not producing the right crops in the right environment at this point in time. So we need to redefine our alternative farming systems again in terms of their geography, where there's.
Yeah, so you're right about there's a long history of farming systems research in Australia, and it's been really sort of enriched by the APSIM. I think the modelers who had this farming systems model, because a lot of the farming systems work, whether it was Brian Keating or like there's a whole raft of them, I think, have helped with that thinking and allowed us to analyse the system. But I think there's a lot to farming systems, beyond the agronomy. There's a lot of context. There's a lot of social. There's a lot of history, and so it's not always easy to sort of come in and make a sudden change. But I think farmers are in my experience, farmers are usually doing something for a reason, and now it might be whether it's economics or even just ease, right? The ease of a farming system. But generally, if there's a more profitable option that's less risky, and increasingly, well, Australian farmers are very much aware of the state of their land. They're mostly family farms. They mostly want to hand it on, so they're aware of soil health and other things like that. But I guess at the end of the day, they still need a market. They still need a reliable market, a consistent market, and they need a system that works. So I've just been reviewing some papers today actually on pesticide-free systems and other systems, and the problem is just the practicalities and the logistics. So I think if there's a good idea that's taking us in the right directions, as I think legume adoption in our system will, partly the farmers as yet are not being rewarded for greenhouse gas emissions. At least in our system, they're not yet being rewarded for that. So it's going to be you know, it's going to be difficult to move them into an area if it's going to cost them more money. But with the right policies and with the right programs in place, and with a lot of direct interaction with growers, so that solutions are practical and pragmatic and feasible, I think that's an important element to always keep in farming systems research, so that then you can, then you can move the dial. But yeah, I agree. My mentor, John Paciora, always used to say that, like, whatever we're working on, as scientists, we focus, right? We have to focus, but at whatever level of organisation you're working at, whether it's a leaf or a plant or a paddock or a region, have coffee with and mix with people that work one level above and one level below, so that you understand, you understand what's possible and you understand where your work might end up. But I think if we keep that interaction going, that's going to, and that's my interest in the book. I'm just trying to be quiet. Cancel system shutdown, it says, Romulo. No, it's. I think it's just a warning about the time. Yep. Yep. Just pulling up a question from online.
Hey, John, thank you. That was a great seminar. I really enjoyed the part about in your long-term tillage trial and sufficient nutrients for building organic matter. Just wondering, what are your thoughts on balancing that, though, with maintaining surface residues, and if we speed up that decomposition, those trade-offs, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that. And the current project that I'm working on, I sort of think of that work we have done as proof of concept. So we now know we've got this nutrient limitation, but how, on a real farm, how can we make that work? So obviously no one's going to rotary hoe, and we don't want them rotary hoeing broadacre fields in Australia. So we're looking at this is only really an option where nutrients are not carbon limiting. So if you've got limited residue, you should leave it where it is, because the biggest value you get from that is water conservation and soil protection. But where you've got levels of residue, as we sometimes do in good seasons, that start to interfere with seeding or with weed control, and you would like to do something with it, we're suggesting, rather than burn it, and if you don't have equipment that can seed into it, then this is an option for those situations. And we're looking at machinery like a thing we call a speed tiller, which incorporates about 70% of the residue but leaves 30% on the surface. And so, yeah, that's a good point. It's really for those situations where you've got a heavy stubble load that in other ways is causing problems. Otherwise, with light stubble loads, we would say this is probably not the technology for you. However, the nutrient limitation is still a thing, and if we train farmers to be so efficient with their nutrients that they only put enough on for the crops, then they can expect their soil organic matter to keep declining. So it just means that how much nutrients coming in the gate and how much is going out the gate, they need to keep their eye on that, and maybe just boost what's going onto the crop if they have a concern that their soil's getting to a level where, our soils get to a level where organic matter gets low enough, the structure falls apart, and then we can't get water into the system. So it's really that's the sort of that's one thing to keep a track of, just that nutrient balance. I think nutrient balance is the missing fourth pillar of conservation agriculture. I think it should be soil cover, diverse systems, minimum till, and positive nutrient balance, or at least neutral. Because you can be doing no-till really well and still be mining your nutrition. I might just go to this last slide before everybody heads off. Please take an Anzac biscuit before you go if you didn't get one, and if there's any left. And look, that's a list of the sort of topics I'd like to cover in my seminar series, and none of those dates are set in stone, but I'm roughly trying to hit one a month. And you know, obviously the one there on May the 8th is all about soil organic matter and soil biology and some of the stuff I've done. I'd be hoping, you know, Chuck Rice was around when I did that, so I'll talk to him. I don't want to. So if any of you think that, you know, one or more of those topics is right on your area, I mean, I'd love for you to be here when I give the seminar. I wouldn't like to miss out, and we're pretty flexible, right, Romulo, on when I give the different talks. So that's just a sort of provisional list, and we'll work on this and distribute it, and I'll try and talk with Romulo about who are the key people that might want to listen in. But that's, at this stage, that's the final one is actually set in stone, because that's a Cortiva meeting that the postgrads are already have planned. So that one's locked in, and the others are pretty flexible. Anyway, thank you, everybody. I think that's. Sure.